the world we are inhabiting is one that is unpredictable and unforgiving, and the organizational models and leadership models that we use are just not very well suited for that reality. In my mind, the companies that will be winning in the next 5 to 10 years are the companies that are really going to take this idea of rewiring their management and leadership models to create far more capable organizations. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Michele and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I hope it is to you as well. I think it is, because you're all very kind of progressive, forward-thinking HR executives, which is how do we make our organizations more fundamentally more capable and more human-centric. And let me actually start with kind of a question for you. Kind of think about the next 5 years. How do you expect your organization, its structures, its systems and processes to evolve? Can you imagine, as you look into the future, an organization that is as different from the current template as Netflix is different from the BBC, right? Or as Airbnb is different from a hotel chain, right? I mean, it's easier to think about an organization that is a little leaner, a little AI kind of empowered, a little bit more agile. But beyond that, what? Can you think of something that is a radical alternative to the status quo? And I think if you're not thinking beyond that, you might want to think again, right? Because the world we are inhabiting is one that is unpredictable and unforgiving, and the organizational models and leadership models that we use are just not very well suited for that reality. And I think it's time to go back to the drawing board, which is a little bit my thesis and sort of was driving a lot of my work and research. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. And I have 5 propositions that are kind of meant to stretch your thinking, to explore different alternatives, as Perry mentioned before, when it comes to leading, managing, and organizing, right? Just a little plug for the book that is coming out in August, but this is only meant to say that today I have limited time, so I'm going to touch on a few topics. So forgive me for a lot of sins of omission, but if you want to go deeper, you know where to find me. Those are my profiles, and you can drop me an email, and I'd love to chat with you more deeply. So with that as kind of a caveat, let's get started with the first proposition, which is, in my mind, the companies that will be winning in the next 5 to 10 years are the companies that are really going to take this idea of rewiring their management and leadership models to create far more capable organizations. And I think this is actually a challenge that faces society more broadly, because we are, as a species, facing a ton of opportunities and a lot of challenges, right? And to make sure that those are tackled properly, we need very capable organizations. And what I mean by capable are 4 things, really. One is organizations that are daring, they're audacious, that are animated by a pioneering spirit. Organizations that are adaptable, that they change before they have to, they can pivot as conditions evolve. That are entrepreneurial, they're kind of hotbeds of game-changing innovation. And lastly, and maybe more importantly, they're inspiring. They're able to amplify and encourage human ingenuity and initiative. And this kind of makes sense in practice, like who's against these things, right? But in theory. But in practice, my sense and my experience is that a lot of organizations don't really exhibit many of these qualities, or at least not as often as they need to, right? And that's kind of my second proposition. A lot of companies, a lot of organizations, especially big ones, are often faint-hearted, right? They are inertial, they are incremental and dispiriting. They're kind of emotionally insipid places. And these are kind of strong words, maybe, a little tough criticism. But in my experience, I've seen this time and time again. In the book, we provide a lot of evidence. But let me just focus on this one in particular, right? Which is about the fact that organizations are not very good at switching on people, which I'm sure is something you care deeply about, right? So focus on that, and I'll just share some evidence. This is global engagement data from Gallup. You might have seen this data, where less than 1 out of 4 people is engaged at work. Most are kind of going by the motions, going through the motions of coming in, showing up, doing things. And some people are actually militating against, the organization. So these are pretty depressing statistics. They've been like this for a long, long time. And for many years, at least when I first saw these numbers, I thought, well, this might be because the work itself is not that interesting, right? And not that engaging. And so you can't expect everybody to be engaged. Some people are doing jobs that I'm sure you are glad you're not doing, right? And I hope you say thank you to those people. But if you look at the data a little further, you see that actually people, when they're asked, are you happy with the tasks, with the work you're carrying out every day? Most of them are actually fairly happy. Almost 90% are somewhat or highly satisfied with the work. So what gives, right? So let's kind of peel the onion a little bit. This is another data point from Gallup, where 1 out of 2 people would have quit their job to get away from a toxic manager in the past. Almost more than a third, right, are kind of willing to take a pay cut to get rid of their boss. And by the way, managers aren't doing great either. It's not that they're like in nirvana. They're in the US, they're just as disengaged as everybody else. And this statistic I just kind of came up with recently. Gen Z, the overwhelming majority of Gen Zers sees this disaster and says, no, thank you. I'd rather just not manage and be an individual contributor. It's too much work. It's too much pressure, too much burnout. Not worth it. So perhaps the problem isn't the work itself, right? Maybe the problem is how we manage and how we're organized. And here's why this matters. Think for a second about a kind of a hierarchy of human capabilities at work, right? A little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you're mostly familiar with that, right? So at the very bottom, you have obedience, right? You can't have a large-scale organization without people following the rules. That's kind of, non-negotiable. You also want people who are diligent, who take responsibility for actions and work hard, right? And you also want people with the right expertise, the right skills to get their job done. Now, these are important skills, important capabilities, but they are not what really gives you a competitive advantage in today's world. They're kind of commodity capabilities. You can buy obedience, you can buy expertise, for cheap around the world. You can get it from OpenAI. You can get it from Google now, right? And so you need more than this to succeed, right? What you need are other kind of higher order kind of capabilities. You want people that have initiative, that will take action before they're told that they need to take action. You want people who are innovative, creative, who are able to reframe problems to see what's happening in other industries and kind of borrow some interesting ideas from that. And you want people, finally, who are driven and moved by this feeling that they can make a difference. Their work is their passion, is their mission, right? And what's really important about these things, about imagination, initiative, and passion, is that these are gifts. And leaders live in a way in a gift economy. So the most important things that they want their teams to exhibit are things that teammates decide to bring to work or not. You can't compel people to be creative, to take initiative. And as the data suggests, most people are actually not doing that. They're saying, no, thank you. And sometimes they're even saying, hell no, right? And that's a problem. Now, again, let's just peel the onion a little further. Why is this happening? Well, these are some, I promise this will get better and more positive, but let's just kind of go down the valley of despair first. So the data is, again, really, really sad, right? 1 out of 10 people feel like they can take risks and to try new things in an organization. Despite all this talk about psychological safety, only 1 in 5 believe that their opinions seem to count at work, right? And these numbers haven't gotten any better. These are Gallup data over the last 5 years on a number of indicators on kind of how workers and employees believe their organization cares for them or the opportunities they have at work. And they're all going in the wrong direction. People, by the way, saw at the height of the pandemic, we were going to have a reset. We were going to have this opportunity to change fundamentally how we lead, manage, and organize. That reset doesn't seem to have happened. In fact, we're kind of backsliding, right? And it's kind of puzzling because we're all trying to make a difference. It's not like we don't care, especially people in this room. So what's happening? And so to me, the problem isn't so much the people. Again, it's more the model, the structures, the processes that we are using to run our organizations. And these models are rooted in industrial era, early 20th century kind of bureaucracy and this kind of managerialism. And that's no longer fit for the world we live in, right? Now, bureaucracy can be many things. This is what how we kind of laid out the model. You can call it management 1.1. I'm not wedded to the idea of using bureaucracy, but there's a template that describes how most large-scale organizations work, right? And I'm sure most of these, if not all, apply to your own organizations, right? And now, you have to give bureaucracy its due, right? It's the fact that you can have efficiency and scale is enabled by having control at a distance, which comes from focusing on rules, standards, and managing, right? So we have to kind of acknowledge this is important, but in the world we live in, that's not the only thing that matters, right? And bureaucracy and this kind of model has a lot of liabilities. And maybe the kind of most pithy way to summarize these is that industrial era management practices, in a way, prioritize, certain things over others. So compliance over contribution, right? And process, which almost becomes an end in itself, versus actual performance and real-world impact. Rules over kind of common sense and reasonable actions. Analysis over audacity. Where's the ROI? Where's the business case for this crazy idea you might have? Imagine if Apple had imposed an ROI hurdle on the iPhone, it would never have happened, right? And managing over making, which means, kind of keeping things locked down versus kind of trying to invent something new that might delight and kind of surprise customers, right? And so these are both important things. So you need both elements of the scale, but what should be like a contested battle between these priorities is like a one-sided kind of thrashing, right? And that's why organizations are not as capable as they need to be. Now, the problem is that bureaucracy grows as the organization grows as well. And it gets to a point where it actually grows faster, I think, than the headcount or revenues. And then, this kind of stuff happens. And this is kind of the dynamic that kind of fuels this kind of bureaucratic growth. I don't have to kind of tell you. I'm sure you've seen a lot of this stuff. And pretty soon, you have an organization that is not very healthy. Its veins start getting clogged. And as bureaucracy per capita goes up, in a way, achievement per capita goes down. And no company is really immune from this. There are a lot of, in the book, we have a lot of examples of once world-beating companies that have been brought to their knees by this, right? And a lot of CEOs, and this actually gives me hope, a lot of CEOs are recognizing that the kind of playbook for kind of offsetting the cost of bureaucracy or just dealing with it in some way no longer works, right? So these are just some quotes from CEOs in recent months. You have Bill Anderson at Bayer saying that, highly capable people are being constrained and the organization is lame. The new CEO of Intel, one of those companies that fell, that was hobbled, their future was stolen by bureaucracy, said, it's suffocating innovation. The new CEO of Amazon saying, people who are entrepreneurial are just burdened by all these processes and things that make it difficult for them to make things. And the JP Morgan Chase CEO, one of the largest banks in America, said it's a disease. It's a petri dish of politics. So despite this frustrations, I think a few leaders, they sense the fact that something needs to change, but they may not know exactly what to do, where to go. Are there really alternatives to this? Bureaucracy sucks, but opposed to what, right? And so this is where I now turn into the good news, right, story, because I do have good news. There are choices. Bureaucracy or this old way of managing is not a law of the universe. It's not a cosmological constant, right? It's a choice that we make every day, right? And we make that in HR, we make it in marketing, we make it in the line. It's something that we kind of are used to, but we necessarily have to put up with, right? And this is my fourth proposition. Now, in my research, and Perry has done a lot of this work as well, we've unearthed a lot of interesting examples of companies that have been able to do the both and. They're getting the benefits of scale and efficiency without paying the management tax, right? And there's a whole list. It's not a huge list, but it's growing and it's incredibly inspiring. And all these companies, in a way, are not quite the same, but they're all, I think, united by a very different assumption about people and work. So in most organizations, at the heart of, in a way, of the bureaucratic model, is this the assumption that the institution hires individuals to have impact, to make a profit, right? And the dilemma is that if you think about this, the individual is the instrument. And I don't know about you, but whenever I've been in an instrumental relationship, like I'm the person who picks up the kids, who does the dishes, who provides, the salary. It's not a very healthy relationship. If that's all you are, you're an instrument, right? And in a way, I think the Gallup data shows that most employees are kind of in a toxic relationship with the employer, right? Now, what if you kind of turn that around? And of course, this is the reality of a lot of people who are in the new generation. They see the organization as their instrument to have an impact in the world. At least that's what they would like the organization to be, right? And it sounds maybe kind of a simple thing, like play on words, but if you actually follow this through, you end up with a very different kind of model. So, what if, you ask yourself this? Like, what if you started with the assumption that people are inherently resilient and capable, courageous, and full of energy and passion and initiative, and you have a positive view of human beings at work, and your challenge is like, how do you amplify this, right? I think you would end up with a very different organizational model. And let me just give you some of, I think my top 10 kind of defining features of this model, right? You would have a hierarchy that is much flatter, that has half the layers at least, half the administrators, half the managers, and where accountability flows in both directions, up and down, where the leaders are accountable to the led, right? Where far fewer mandates and rules, where with a very disaggregated structure, with lots of small kind of self-managing teams who have a real P&L responsibility, or as close as you can get to that is far more lateral than it is vertical. It's more a community of communities where coordination happens not because of centralization, but because of collaboration across silos and boundaries, where staff functions are accountable to the teams because they're actually they're integral drivers of value added and serving the customer, where leadership is really about enabling and encouraging, right? Not commanding and controlling or micromanaging, where allocation of talent, and other resources, capital, happens much more dynamically with market-like mechanisms, short time cycles, not year-long planning processes, and so on, where authority and compensation don't necessarily correlate with rank. They correlate more with value added, which is attested either by the market or by peers. Where control still happens, but it happens in a different way. It happens through values and a shared purpose. It happens through transparency. It happens through having the right skills to make the right decisions and the right information to make the right trade-offs. Right? So again, it's control still happens, but in a different way. And lastly, where everyone feels like the organization is theirs. There's this deep sense of ownership in the organization and what it's trying to do. So these are the 10 kind of defining elements, if you wish, of a humanocracy. Again, you can call it post-bureaucratic organization. I'm not really wedded to the title, but I hope this is an exciting and inspiring vision. And I know many of you are setting out to build some of these traits in your organizations, right? Now, the question is, how do you get there, right? It seems like really daunting, almost impossible. And what I want to close with, this is my last proposition, is that it's totally possible. In fact, I think it's the only way you get nonlinear improvements in performance, if you kind of pursue these kinds of changes. And I wanted to kind of spend my last few minutes just showing you a real-world example of what this looks like. And it comes from Roche, where I had the chance with Gary to do some in-depth research over the last few years in preparation for the book. And it's a really great example, I think, of how you can make lasting change happen. And it also highlights the role that HR leaders can play in catalyzing this change. So hopefully this is like something that will inspire you. And the story begins about 8 years ago when three of their best-selling drugs, which were worth about $32 billion, were coming off patent. So they were going to lose all that revenue. And the CEO basically said, we need to kind of build a new bridge to our growth. And his name is Severin Schwan. And he understood that the only way to do that is to become fundamentally more agile as an organization. But a lot of leaders at Roche weren't very bought into that. So he actually asked Tammy Lowry, the chief talent officer, to say, help me build a kind of consciousness-raising session where we can all understand and get religion on this, right? And that thing was called Kinesis, like a 4-day program that ended up being really transformational. So I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit of what they did. So the first thing they did, this is before the event, people completed a comprehensive assessment of their leadership kind of traits, right, and inclinations. So these are the 29 traits across 8 categories. And you had colleagues that assessed others as well. And then when they came together, there's this big, big circle. Imagine this diagram as on the floor. And leaders were then told to sit where their dominant traits kind of indicated, when the results indicated to be their dominant traits. Where do you think most people went? Any guesses? They were here. They're all bunched up there. And that's exactly what you would expect in a bureaucratic organization that values compliance and predictability, right? Now, task and control orientations are virtues, but they're almost always overdone, right? And they don't scale either. They were working crazy hours, trying to drive the business, but it's almost like going at 180 kilometers an hour in a sports car in 3rd gear. At some point, the transmission gives out, right? You're just burning out. And so what they understood that they wanted to increase their ability to have more impact per unit of time and effort, right? And the way to do that wasn't by doubling down on micromanagement. So what they ended up doing instead is to think about this kind of shift, from command and control to envision and enable. And so the role of the leader was less about running the business, but building a better one, a new one. And they, with coaching at this event and afterwards, they experimented with new behaviors, delegating more, reducing meeting attendance, and mentoring, right? And this is sort of how Tammy Lowry summed up the shift or the vision. Leadership as a support function. I love that, right? I think it's incredibly descriptive and challenging, too. It wasn't easy. And people realized that, they had a long way to go, but they thought this was worth pursuing. Now, they also spent a little bit of time during the workshop going through some examples of companies that are managed very differently, some of the ones I hinted at before, right? There was some pushback, and people are saying, some of these companies are not in our industry, they're not like us, but they all understood, there were options beyond the current template, right? So this kind of opened a lot of minds. So they ended up with 3 conclusions, in a way, at this event. The first is that the system we have is a choice, not a cosmological constant. This is on us, right, as leaders. The second is that, we cannot be the architects of the future if our first instinct is to defend the status quo. So we have to let go of that. And the last thing is that they all understood this is kind of change isn't going to be happening top-down where everything gets prescribed and, pushed out very neatly, cascaded down. I hate that term. Cascade, but they understood that this had to be something that was experimented upon. And so there was no real mandate to leaders other than try something in your organization. Now, one of the people that did try something and had amazing impact is Bill Anderson, who at the time was CEO of Genentech, which is their US business, the largest business in Roche Pharmaceuticals. He's now the CEO of Bayer. I mentioned him earlier. And he basically said, I'm really going to take this to heart. And so he gathered his team right after the workshop, not to discuss near-term performance, but to build a radically more capable organization. So he met with his team every day, every other week. So one day every other week for almost a year. The team had never met so much, never spent so much time with each other. And they focused each day on 2 things. So in the morning, or in the first half, they thought about what kind of organization do we want to build? And what is our role in enabling that? In the second half, they spent time thinking about, what is it that we can do, right, to help our colleagues on this journey? How do we support more audacious thinking? So this, it was a big effort of time, and it created a lot of space for thinking differently and imagining the new. And one of the things that this group came up with was a set of principles that would guide the work of reinvention, and these are the 4 principles they had. All right, ownership, patient focus, collegiality, and empowerment, and kind of decisiveness. And I love the framing of these because they're all about the relationship between employees and their work, and it's kind of easy to measure whether you have these or not, right? So these principles then led to a number of radical management practices. I'm just going to mention a couple real quick. One is the shift to autonomous squads. They were a very functional organization. They ended up creating about a dozen squads that were cross-functional with P&L responsibility, focused on the customer. So everybody was kind of the customer, the patient. So everybody was kind of patient-focused, and decisions that would take months ended up being taken in days, if not weeks, because they were all kind of together and making decisions autonomously for different products and different therapeutic areas. The other thing that they did is they reinvented the way resources get allocated. So they got rid of targets. They said, you don't have to plan for us as management, plan for what you think is right. Of course, there were incentives for achieving bold targets, but it was much more bottom-up than it was top-down. And they scrapped the top-down budgeting annual cycle. They had a 90-day series of cycles of resource allocation. There was one giant budget that was reallocated between the squads as conditions shifted. And so these changes, by the way, took place not only within Genentech, but across Roche internationally as well. So I'm just giving you a thumbnail sketch. But the interesting thing about this experience overall within 5 years is like this amazing improvement in performance. You know, higher revenues with fewer people, billions of dollars that were freed up for R&D and taking care of patients. So a really kind of amazing experience, right? And let me just close with a few lessons, and I'll do this quickly because I know I'm running a little over, so forgive me. Because there's no blueprint for building an organization that maximizes achievement, right, and the contribution of every member. There's no single path that you need to take. But I think there are some lessons we can kind of tease out from cases like Roche. The first is that leadership definitely matters. You don't have to be a CXO to do this kind of work, but definitely having those people on your side shrinks the timeline to impact. And I think there are 4 things that really made a difference in terms of leadership at Roche. The first is that leaders were open to new ways of managing and leading. They were courageous and open-minded enough to see alternatives. And they didn't, by the way, benchmark anybody in pharma because there weren't that many great benchmarks, right? So you have to kind of go beyond that. The second is that they were quite courageous, in thinking that, we do need to change. And they actually saw that the risk of not changing was higher than the risk of trying something responsibly and by kind of constraining risks. They're also courageous, personally, right? They had to make this shift, right? From being the command and control person to being someone who mobilizes and mentors. And they got a lot of support in making this happen. The other thing that they did is they didn't fix one thing hoping it would kind of all work out. They really focused on changing a number of things over time, right? So this is from a memo that Bill wrote to employees when this got started, where he basically said, look, I've tried this before, changing one thing, doubling down on process. It doesn't work. He said, I realized that the problem is the whole system. So having this kind of a systemic approach and systemic vision of the problem, I think is key. The other thing is that perseverance matters. Yes, you can get impact and make progress very quickly, within months even, but this is not a program, right? This is a quest. It'll take many years. Now, the other thing I would say is that leadership matters, but leaders can't do it alone. Roche leaders all admitted that they didn't have all the answers. So a lot of the changes I mentioned earlier came from employees who designed those processes in a collaborative, kind of open way. And definitely not your typical change programs. Like a lot of those processes were co-designed by people and they were experimented before getting scaled. So in a way, it's exactly the opposite of top-down change management. And the last thing I would leave you with is this. You can do this. It can be done, and you should, right? And, as HR leaders, I think your role is really pivotal, right? The best way, I think, to become strategic, which is always the aspiration of HR, is to become the kind of the catalyst, right, for this kind of capability building. And I think you have a real opportunity, in a way, even a responsibility, right, to challenge outdated management practices, to experiment boldly, to co-create organizations where individuals can bring their full initiative, ingenuity, and passion to work. And I can't think of a more exciting and more meaningful problem to solve. And my hope is that many of you will take this on, right here, or right now, or at least, or when you get back to the office. So with that, thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, and over to you.